The earth beneath the old Burmese pagoda was never silent. Even in the stillness of dawn, when mist folded over the valley like a shroud and the world was too drowsy to stir, something moved beneath the stone. Travelers who passed along the overgrown forest path claimed they heard it first, not with their ears, but with the cold prickling that ran down their spine. A trembling, a shiver, a thrum like breath held too long beneath the soil. And if they listened closely, if they dared, they swore they heard murmurs, thin, wavering whispers rising from the foundation, as though the dead were telling secrets they never meant the living to hear. It was the kind of sound that made even seasoned wanderers quicken their pace, pretending it was only the wind. But deep down they knew, wind does not whisper names. And so, before we enter this dark chapter of history, before we step into the forgotten pagodas where bricks were fed with blood and foundations were anchored with human lives, let me welcome you. You have chosen to walk into the shadows of Burma's past, where legend and truth blend, where kings bargained with spirits, and where stories buried for centuries still breathe if you press your ear against the stone. I'm grateful to have you here on this unsettling journey. If you enjoy unraveling the chilling corners of lost history, I'd appreciate it deeply if you would subscribe. It helps us travel further into the past, deeper into the stories that were never meant to be told. And now, let us begin. If you like what follows, please don't forget to subscribe. Burma, modern-day Myanmar, is a land draped in gold temples and thick jungle, where the air carries the perfume of incense and the weight of old faiths. The people respect the unseen as much as the seen, for the world here is layered. Spirits dwell not only in the sky or in sacred groves, but in every stone, every river, every root. They are called nats, restless, unpredictable, easily angered, and their presence shapes the daily life of entire villages. To build anything of permanence, especially something meant to reach the heavens, one must appease these spirits. A blessing, a chant, an offering of food or flowers. But in ancient times, there were whispers that some offerings required more than flowers. Some demanded a beating heart. The origins of the sacrificial pagodas are lost somewhere between truth and terror. Elders claimed the tradition began during a period when kingdoms rose quickly and fell even faster, toppled by war, storms, or their own ambitions. Architects, desperate to build monuments that would survive the earth's fury, turned to the most ancient superstition of all, that a living soul interred beneath the foundation would bind the building to the land forever. A soul given becomes a soul trapped, and a trapped soul has no choice but to hold the structure together until the end of time. It was not a belief spoken openly. Even in the earliest chronicles, the words are circled around with euphemisms: a life given for stability, a guardian beneath, a spirit invoked into the foundation. Yet folklore was far less gentle. Children were told not to wander too close to a site where a new pagoda was rising, for the earth might call their names. Builders would warn each other never to work after sunset, when shadows grew long enough for the dead to slip through.
One such pagoda, though weathered and half consumed by creeping vines, still stands in the remote hills near Mandalay. Locals call it the Thaye Zedi, the Ghost Pagoda. Its exact age is unknown. Its bricks have no inscription, no era carved into stone, no king's decree etched into the walls. It simply exists, like an uninvited guest from another time. Travelers who approach it speak of an oppressive stillness, as though the jungle itself watches with narrowed eyes. Birds fall silent here. The wind softens. And beneath the first wide step of the crumbling stairway, where shadow clings like tar, the whispers begin. In the old days, the region was ruled by a king whose ambitions were said to stretch higher than any Zedi of his era. His astrologers warned him that the fate of his dynasty was tied to the heavens, and that only a tower touching the sky could anchor his reign to destiny. And so he commanded the greatest architect in his kingdom to build a pagoda stronger and taller than any before it. The architect, a man revered for his genius, bowed with pride, but even he knew that such a task flirted with danger. The earth beneath Mandalay was restless. Earthquakes were known to swallow entire villages, leaving nothing but cracked soil and echoing cries. If the pagoda collapsed, the king would blame him. If it stood, the king would claim the glory. But if it were to rise and never fall, it would need more than bricks. The architect visited the chosen site at dawn, watching the first swell of sunlight spill over the land. He saw the grove where gnats were believed to linger, the river known for drowning more people than it carried boats, the patch of wild orchids locals refused to touch because legend said they grew from the graves of wronged spirits. The air was thick with old stories, dangerous stories. He felt the weight of the king's demand settle on his shoulders like a cold hand. When he returned to the palace, the astrologers surrounded him, whispering calculations of stars and shadows. They spoke of the earth's hunger. They spoke of omens. They spoke of an ancient practice that had not been performed in generations. He tried to refuse, but no one refuses a king who dreams of eternity. Rumors began to spread. Villagers noticed strange men roaming at night, marking doorposts with ashes. Mothers kept their children close. Men whispered of vanished travelers, of workers who never returned from surveying the site. The kingdom was not at war, yet fear settled over the region like a fog. And though no announcement was made, everyone knew something would be taken, something living, something breathing, something that would never again see the sky.
Yet for all the fear, the pagoda began to rise. Day by day, its lower tiers took shape. Workers said the earth groaned beneath the stone, but held firm, as though an unseen force pressed upward from beneath. When the first platform was completed, the astrologers declared the foundation ready. A ceremony was held at dusk, though nobody dared watch. Curtains were drawn over windows. Children were told to cover their ears. Drums beat through the night, steady and slow, like a heart being lulled to sleep. And when morning came, the workers found the cornerstones sealed, smelling faintly of incense and something metallic. No one asked questions. They simply continued to build. Over time, stories grew like vines around the pagoda's fame. Some said a child had been taken, chosen because she was born on a night when the moon hid behind clouds. Others said it was a traveler whose existence no one would question. Another version claimed it was a volunteer, a man with nothing left to live for, who believed his sacrifice would bring him honor in the spirit world. But the whispers beneath the pagoda suggested none of these tales were quite right. The murmurs were too many, too layered, too full of voices that did not agree. And now, centuries later, the pagoda still stands, cracked, leaning slightly, choked by roots, yet unmistakably alive. Locals refuse to approach at night, for they say the spirits beneath grow restless in the dark. And in the rainy season, when storms roll across the valley and thunder cracks the sky open, the pagoda is said to shake, not from the weather, but from the trapped souls pounding against their prison, desperate to be heard. This is the story of how such pagodas came to be, of the architect who feared the king more than death, the villagers who prayed their names would not be called, the astrologers who saw blood as destiny, and the ghosts who were promised eternity and given a cage. And as we journey deeper into these haunted foundations, into the chapters where the truth grows sharper and the legends darker, remember that some structures are not built, they are fed. The architect had always believed that stone was honest. In his youth, he learned that a building never lied.
Its cracks told the truth of pressure. Its slant whispered the secrets of uneven soil. Its color revealed the fire or damp it had endured. Stone was a language written for those with patience. But as he stood at the edge of the clearing where the new pagoda was to rise, he realized that there were truths older and far darker than anything he had learned. Truths that did not live in stone, but beneath it. The forest around him bristled with the tension of something unseen. Cicadas screeched, then fell abruptly silent. Leaves trembled with no wind to move them. There was a heaviness in the air, like the breath before a storm. And beneath his feet he sensed a pulse, slow, deliberate, as though the earth itself was thinking, watching, waiting. He never believed in such things before, but now, under the pressure of the king's command and the astrologer's ominous mutterings, he felt the first seed of doubt burrow into him. Perhaps some foundations demanded more than skill. Perhaps some demanded obedience from the living and silence from the dead. The king's court astrologers had summoned him the night before, their chamber lit only by candles that flickered violently despite the stillness of the air. They spoke not in full sentences, but in fragments, calculated star paths, ominous planetary alignments, ancient verses from scrolls hidden in the palace archives. Their words slithered around him, weaving a net from which he could not escape. The kingdom's future hung on the pagoda, they insisted. The stability of the land itself required spiritual anchoring. Something had stirred beneath the soil, an imbalance, a hunger, a disturbance older than the kingdom itself, and the spirits demanded appeasement. He had tried to argue, he had tried to reason, but the look in the astrologer's eyes, the hollow certainty of men who believed they spoke for powers beyond mortal comprehension, silenced him. And when the king entered the chamber, robed in gold and shadow, the architect fell to his knees without even thinking. The king's voice was calm, almost gentle, yet wrapped in iron. The pagoda must stand for eternity. No storm, no war, no curse must bring it down. Build it strong, the king murmured, and build it loyal. Loyal. The architect did not understand the word then, but he would soon. Now, as he examined the soil, he understood why the astrologers had been summoned so urgently. The ground was unstable. It dipped, cracked, shifted with the slightest pressure. Any ordinary pagoda built here would sink or tilt eventually, but the king had chosen this site deliberately. He believed the area was sacred, a confluence of energies, a meeting of spirits. To relocate would mean defying not just the astrologers, but destiny itself. And so the architect knelt, scooping the earth into his hand, feeling the grainy weight of the land he was supposed to tame. It slipped through his fingers like sand escaping a grasp. He felt something cold slither beneath the soil, some ancient presence brushing against his senses. He stood quickly, heart pounding, though he could not say why.
The workers began clearing the land the next morning. They hacked through thick vines, felled trees, burned brush, but the forest resisted. Tools dulled unnaturally fast. Trees that should have fallen easily seemed to cling to the earth as if rooted with willpower instead of roots. One worker swore he saw pale fingers in the undergrowth gripping his ankles before vanishing. Another claimed the vines tightened around his throat like living nooses. The architect dismissed these stories at first. Fear always turned nature into monsters, but he could not deny the way the workers' faces paled with each passing day, or how they avoided the site after dusk, whispering of shadows that moved against the light. Despite the struggles, the clearing grew. The architect mapped out the pagoda's design meticulously, measuring each angle with precision. But every time he redrew the plans, his hand hesitated at the foundation. There was something wrong about the place where the cornerstone was meant to go. The soil there felt colder, darker, almost oily to the touch. At night, as he sat by candlelight reviewing the blueprints, he found himself sketching faces into the stone, faces of the workers, the villagers, people he passed in the marketplace.
The candle flame flickered with every breath he took, casting shadows that seemed to stretch long fingers across the parchment. It was on the 7th day that the astrologers returned. They arrived at twilight, robes fluttering like black wings, their expressions gaunt and severe. Without greeting the architect, they walked directly to the center of the foundation, stood in a circle, and began chanting. Their voices rose and fell like a tide of dread, echoing off the trees. The workers stopped what they were doing and backed away slowly, eyes wide, hands shaking. When the chant ended, one astrologer turned to the architect. His face was pale, almost translucent, as though something had drained the warmth from him. "The earth has accepted the site," he said quietly, "but it requires an anchor." The architect felt a chill slide down his spine. "What anchor?" he asked, though he feared the answer. The astrologer did not speak. Instead, he placed a small wooden box into the architect's hands. The architect hesitated before opening it, but when he did, he found a small clay figurine inside, simple, unpainted, but unmistakably human-shaped. It was hollow, fragile, waiting to be filled. His hands trembled. He understood what the figurine symbolized: a vessel, a representation, something that echoed a life. But a representation alone was not enough. The astrologer's eyes told him everything. The pagoda required a living soul, a soul that would remain beneath the cornerstone for as long as the structure stood.
The architect felt sick. He looked around the clearing, watching the workers laugh nervously among themselves, unaware of what their future might hold. He saw the villagers beyond the trees, carrying baskets of rice and water. He saw children chasing each other through the ferns, and in that moment, the weight of his responsibility crushed him. He would design the pagoda, he would oversee its construction, but he would also be complicit in choosing the life that would be taken. The astrologers left without further explanation. The architect remained behind, clutching the box until his knuckles turned white. That night, he returned to his tent and could not sleep. The jungle whispered outside, leaves scraping like restless fingers. The wind carried faint voices he could not understand. He closed his eyes tightly, but the image of the empty figurine haunted him. A body for a soul for a foundation. The king arrived shortly after, surrounded by soldiers and servants. He inspected the construction site with a satisfied smile, but when he spoke to the architect, his tone darkened. "The astrologers have told me the pagoda will need a guardian," he said. "You will choose wisely." The architect bowed deeply, hiding his trembling hands. "Your Majesty, must it be done?" he asked. The king's eyes narrowed. "If the pagoda is to stand forever, the price must be paid. Eternity has never come cheaply." From that day forward, the architect walked through the village with a heavy heart. Every face he saw became a question. Every smile became a potential sacrifice. The villagers greeted him with respect, unaware of the storm gathering behind his eyes. He watched fathers teaching their sons to carve wood, mothers braiding their daughters' hair by lantern light. Life continued around him as though the world were not on the brink of swallowing one of them whole. At the construction site, the workers began laying the initial stones. Their hammers rang across the clearing, masking the faint murmurs rising from beneath the earth. The architect stood by the foundation, feeling the figurine in his pocket. The weight of it seemed to grow heavier each day, as though it absorbed his dread. At night, he dreamed of the pagoda towering into the sky, but instead of stone, it was made of bones. Instead of golden paint, it was coated in the dust of forgotten souls. He woke each time drenched in sweat, heart pounding like a drum of war. The day the selection was made, he did not sleep. He watched the sun rise over the clearing, painting the earth red like blood. The villagers gathered for a festival honoring a local knot, bringing offerings of fruit, rice, and candles. Children danced barefoot in the grass, their laughter echoing through the valley. The architect watched, numb. A finger of cold wind brushed past him, stirring the hem of his robe. He looked up and saw the astrologers watching him from the edge of the crowd, their gazes sharp as knives.
The decision had to be made before nightfall. The foundation could not wait. And so the architect walked among the villagers, each step heavier than the last. He paused by the riverbank where a young woman knelt washing clothes. She looked up and smiled kindly at him. He turned away quickly. He passed a group of elderly men sharing stories, their faces creased with age. Too old, he thought. The spirits demanded youth, vitality, someone the earth would consider worthy. His breath came shallow, his pulse thundered in his ears. It was then that he saw the boy. Small, quiet, sitting alone beneath a tree, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. The architect recognized him instantly, the son of a widowed woman who lived on the outskirts of the village. The boy rarely spoke. Some said he was touched by spirits, for he often stared at empty spaces as though listening to voices no one else could hear. The architect's stomach twisted. He knew the astrologers would choose the boy if he did not. They would call him destined, marked, a bridge between worlds. The boy looked up, eyes dark and strangely calm. The architect froze. In those eyes he thought he saw understanding, perhaps even acceptance, as though the child already knew his fate, as though the earth had been waiting for him. The architect turned away, unable to bear the weight of the boy's gaze. But the decision had been made, and the pagoda would soon claim its guardian. Beneath the soil, the whispers grew stronger, rising like breath before a scream. The foundation was almost ready, the cornerstone carved and waiting. The architect knew what the next night would bring. He knew the drums would sound again. He knew the astrologers would chant. He knew the earth would be fed. And as the sun dipped behind the trees, staining the sky red, the architect realized something horrifying. The pagoda would not only bear the weight of the king's ambition, it would bear the weight of his guilt forever. The first disappearance did not come with screams or warning. It slipped into the village as quietly as dusk settling over the treetops, unnoticed at first, then spreading through the community like a sickness, slow, creeping, inevitable. It began with the children, for it is always the children who feel the tremors of darkness before adults choose to acknowledge it. They heard things long before anyone else did. They felt the shift in the earth, the shiver in the wind, the watchful gaze of the forest, and they whispered among themselves of something moving beneath the pagoda site, something that called to them with voices soft as leaves brushing the earth, something lonely, something hungry. Mothers, as always, were the first to sense trouble. In the early mornings, when the river glowed with the soft gold of dawn and washing clothes became a ritual of comfort, they noticed their children were waking with nightmares, dreams of being buried beneath soil, of cold fingers brushing their ankles, of a shadowed figure standing near their mats at night. At first, these fears were dismissed as imaginings, the result of hearing too many whispered stories about the king's ambitious project. But when the nightmares became nightly, and the children spoke with trembling voices of ground voices, the mothers grew uneasy. The boy chosen by the architect lingered most heavily in everyone's minds, though few knew his fate. His mother sensed something wrong days before he vanished. She said he woke at odd hours of the night, sitting perfectly still, staring at the road that led toward the pagoda site. She said he scraped his nails against the floorboards as though searching for something beneath them. And she said his eyes had begun to darken, not in color, but in depth, as though he were seeing farther than a child should ever see. One morning, he simply did not return from collecting firewood. His mother searched until her voice cracked. The villagers formed groups to comb the forest, calling his name until the sound became strange and hollow in their throats. Even the architect, sickened by guilt, joined the search, stumbling through the trees until his legs threatened to give out. But the forest returned nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded bundle of sticks. Only silence and the feeling that something had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace. The astrologers, when questioned, were expressionless. Their calmness chilled the village. They said the boy had been chosen by destiny, as though destiny were a creature that prowled in the night. They said the earth accepts who it calls, as though the soil beneath their feet was a living throat. And they said nothing more. The mother collapsed in grief, and her cries echoed across the river, sharp enough to peel bark from the trees. But worse was yet to come. Children began avoiding the path near the pagoda, refusing to fetch water from the river at dusk or gather fruit from the groves. They said the trees whispered when they passed. They said they felt eyes on their backs, cold and heavy as the monsoon sky. Some children claimed they saw the missing boy among the roots, peering from between tree trunks, his body half-shaded, his movements too smooth, as though the forest itself breathed him in and exhaled him out. Adults dismissed these sightings, but the architect did not. Each time he heard a new account, his stomach twisted, for he knew where the boy truly was, or at least what the astrologers had done with him. And yet the thought of the boy's spirit lingering in the forest, lost and furious, haunted him far more than the truth of the ritual. As the foundation of the pagoda began to take shape, the atmosphere in the village thickened. Before, the sight had merely felt eerie, but now it seemed almost predatory. Workers spoke in hushed tones about footsteps echoing behind them, though no one was there. Some refused to work after dark, claiming they felt hands brushing against their ankles when the fog rolled in. Tools left neatly in piles were scattered by morning. Stone blocks shifted overnight as though nudged by invisible forces. When the second child disappeared, fear took root. She was a girl of 8, bright and lively, known for weaving little grass animals and leaving them outside people's doors. Her absence was noticed immediately. One moment she was weaving beside her grandmother's hut, the next she was gone. Her grandmother swore she heard a rustling behind the hut, soft as footsteps on moss. She claimed she heard the girl's name whispered by a voice too gentle to be human, a voice that did not belong to anything with lungs. The search parties this time were desperate. They beat drums, burned incense, prayed loudly to the gnats and ancestors. But as before, the forest gave nothing back. The villagers grew restless, gathering outside their homes at dusk, holding lanterns tighter than one holds breath. Parents forbade their children from leaving their sight. The entire village felt as though it was shrinking, withdrawing into itself like a frightened animal. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the children had been taken by forest spirits angered by the construction. Others believed the king demanded sacrifices and the astrologers were the collectors. A few whispered of curses, of old stories their grandparents had told them, stories about pagodas that required living offerings to stay upright, about shadows trapped beneath stone forever screaming for freedom. The architect could no longer look anyone in the eye. His sleep had become fractured, filled with visions of soil swallowing small bodies and pagodas rising on pillars of bones. He often wandered alone to the construction site, staring at the cornerstones sealed after the ritual. The air around it felt colder. Sometimes he thought he heard faint thuds, like fists striking from below. He would stand frozen, trembling, until the sound faded, or until he convinced himself it had never been there at all. But the villagers noticed something else. The pagoda grew faster after each disappearance. Stones settled more firmly. Cracks sealed themselves. The workers reported fewer disturbances. It was as though the structure were feeding, growing stronger with each child lost to the forest. And that realization bred a terror more profound than any ghost story. The terror that maybe the pagoda wanted them. Maybe it hungered. The most frightening incident occurred on a night when the moon was absent, leaving the world drowned in darkness so thick it felt like cloth against the skin. A group of workers, unable to sleep after hearing rustling near their tents, gathered around a fire. They whispered anxiously, clutching their tools like weapons. Then, from the direction of the pagoda site, came a soft sound, a humming, a lullaby. The workers froze. The humming grew louder. It was unmistakably a child's voice, high, tremulous, melodic. Then another voice joined it, a girl's voice. The two harmonized in a haunting melody that did not belong to the living. The men stood rooted in terror, unable to move, unable to breathe. When the lullaby ended, silence swallowed the camp so completely that even the fire seemed afraid to crackle. The next morning, the workers refused to return to the site. Even the foreman, a hardened man who had survived landslides and monsoon floods, trembled as he told the architect what they had heard. The architect listened, pale and hollow-eyed. He knew the voices. He had heard those lullabies before, echoes from the festival days, when children played along the riverbank. His heart clenched as he realized what the pagoda had become: a vessel, a mouth, a prison. Whispers of fleeing began to swirl around the village. Families packed small bundles preparing to leave under the cover of night. But the astrologers, sensing unrest, returned with soldiers. They declared that anyone who abandoned the project would be seen as defying the king himself. The village was trapped, as surely as the spirits beneath the pagoda were trapped. No one entered, no one left, not without risking their lives. And then, as if to seal their fate, an ill omen struck. The river, usually calm and predictable, rose suddenly, flooding its banks. It devoured the footbridge, drowned nearly half the rice paddies, and swept away livestock. The villagers wailed that the spirits were angry, demanding their due. The astrologers claimed the river's fury proved the necessity of the pagoda. Only when the structure was complete, they said, would the land calm again. The architect felt crushed under the weight of it all. He realized that the project had spiraled beyond his control, slipping into the hands of forces both human and not. The village's eyes burned with bitterness when they looked at him. He had become a symbol of their suffering, the unwilling but undeniable agent of the pagoda's hunger. As the third disappearance loomed, because by now everyone knew it would come, the air grew heavy with dread. Children walked clinging to their parents. Adults kept their lanterns burning through the night, and the earth beneath the pagoda whispered more loudly, as though calling out for the next soul. The children who vanished became ghosts long before death claimed them. Their laughter turned into echoes from the forest, their names carried by the wind, their presence felt in every shadow. And the villagers knew, deep down, that the pagoda would not stop, not after one child, not after two, not until its foundations were fed enough to stand unshaken. But nothing could prepare them for what the fourth night brought, or the truth the forest would soon reveal, a truth buried too deep to stay hidden.
By the time the third child vanished, the village no longer pretended that this was chance. The disappearances had lined up too neatly with the progress of the pagoda. Each new level of stone seemed to demand a fresh absence, and each absence left a raw, invisible wound in the fabric of daily life. The spaces where laughter used to live grew heavy with silence, and the silence seeped outward, into the forest, into the river, into the foundations of the rising structure. The pagoda climbed toward the sky with a solemn determination, its growing tiers casting longer and longer shadows over a community shrinking into fear. The whispers of the old ones, those who remembered stories from before the king's reign, grew bolder. Sitting by dim lamps in the evenings, they told the younger villagers of older pagodas, long lost to jungle and time, that were said to be fed with more than stone. They spoke of a belief buried deep in the older layers of their culture, long before written records and temple chronicles tamed the past into neat lines of ink. The belief said that a building with a soul could never truly fall. Give a structure a spirit, they murmured, and it will stand even when the earth shakes. But spirits did not attach themselves freely. They had to be bound. They had to be tied with rituals made of blood and breath and final cries swallowed by soil. The architect, who had once walked through the village as a figure of respect, now moved like a ghost among ghosts. He heard the whispers and recognized the old stories.
There had been hints of these beliefs in dusty court manuscripts, in marginal notes made by nervous scribes who had wanted to record everything and yet hide what they wrote at the same time. He had treated them as distant myth. Now those myths had risen like the pagoda itself, towering over him, demanding not interpretation but obedience. Each new stone that clicked into place felt like another knot tightening around his conscience. Construction had settled into a ritual of its own. At dawn, workers climbed the growing tiers, carrying baskets of bricks on their backs. The air was cool then, easier to breathe, before the sun burned the clearing into a white glare. Hammers and chisels rang in a harsh, syncopated rhythm that drowned out the subtler sounds. As the day lengthened, fatigue set in, and the men tried not to glance at the foundation far below, where the cornerstone lay sealed like a tomb. They had all seen the thin cracks of dried offering that had once seamed the edge of that stone, the faint discoloration that could not be washed away no matter how many times rain scoured it. None of them wanted to dwell on what had seeped into the earth beneath. On certain days, the astrologers declared the time favorable for rites. Those mornings began differently. No tools were lifted, no stones were moved. Instead, the clearing filled with smoke from incense and the low drone of chanting. The workers were ordered to stand at the edges of the site, away from the center, their eyes downcast. The villagers, forced to attend but forbidden to stand too close, gathered beneath the trees like shadows, watching shadows. In the center of the foundation platform, priests and astrologers formed a circle, their faces smeared with pale paste, their eyes ringed by sleeplessness and a fanatic gleam. The rituals themselves were not openly savage. That was the most frightening part. There were no frenzied scenes of violence in the manner of crude stories. Instead, the rites unfolded with terrible precision, like a carefully practiced dance. Offerings of rice, fruit, flowers, and water were placed in elaborate patterns around the cornerstone. Sacred syllables were traced in powder along the stone's edges. The air vibrated with repeated chants invoking stability, protection, and binding. Every word was aimed downward into the soil. The villagers listened, understanding that these were not prayers for the living, but orders for the unseen. On one such day, the architect stood closer than usual, permitted to be near the inner circle because his role as designer placed him at the heart of the project. He watched as the astrologers opened a new clay vessel, larger than the small figurine he once held, but shaped with the same intent. It was hollow, ready to contain more than air. Into it were added small tokens, a lock of hair, a scrap of cloth, a miniature carved image of the pagoda itself. Each object was murmured over before being placed inside, each one representing multiple meanings: identity, loyalty, destiny. Finally, the vessel was sealed with a slow, deliberate press of clay. The architect's gaze drifted to the edge of the clearing, where he saw the newest grieving family. Their child had disappeared just days before, swallowed into the same mystery that had claimed the others. The mother's face looked carved from stone, the eyes too empty to hold tears anymore. The father gripped his own arm so hard the knuckles were white. They watched the ritual as if watching their own loss being given a shape and a place in the world above ground. The sealed vessel was carried to the cornerstone with reverence. The chanting grew louder, rising and falling in waves that made the air feel thick, almost solid. The astrologers knelt around the cornerstone, pressing their hands to the stone's surface as though speaking through it. The architect felt a pressure in his chest, a tightness that refused to ease. He knew the symbolism, he understood the layers. The vessel did not literally contain the child, yet everyone present knew it did in another way, in the unseen realm where symbols and souls intertwined. The missing children's names were never spoken aloud, but they hung heavily in every pause between chants. When the vessel was finally lowered into a cavity at the side of the cornerstone, a silence fell. The moment stretched until the jungle's hum seemed to stop. The architect felt the hairs on his arms lift, as though the world itself were drawing a breath. Then the priests began to close the cavity, stone meeting stone, mortar pressed in like a final sentence written with no intention of erasing. The last glimpse of the clay vessel vanished beneath the slab. What unsettled the workers most was what came next. As the priests withdrew, the cornerstone seemed to settle deeper into the earth with a faint, almost imperceptible shift. The foundation stones around it, which had been slightly misaligned despite repeated attempts to adjust them, now sat flush and even as though guided by invisible hands. Cracks that had previously resisted filling now merged smoothly. It was as if the pagoda itself, once restless and unstable, had relaxed after receiving what it wanted.
Word of these changes spread quickly, twisting the villagers' fear into something more complicated. Some began to mutter that the rites were working, that the sacrifices, unspoken but understood, were stabilizing the land. Others insisted this was precisely the horror, that the structure's strength was purchased with lives. They looked at the rising tears and saw not devotion made visible, but a monument built from absence, each brick resting on a child-shaped void. At night, the connection between blood and stone became harder to ignore. The workers who slept closest to the site began to report strange sensations. They would wake in the darkest hours before dawn to the feeling of a faint vibration under their mats, as if the earth were breathing. Some described a slow, rhythmic thudding, reminiscent of a distant heartbeat. Others said they felt a pulling sensation, a subtle dragging downward, as if gravity had thickened around the pagoda. Dreams intensified, visions of narrow spaces, walls pressing close, soil pressing against skin, muffled cries that were not their own. The architect experienced these dreams too. He saw the foundations from below, not above, as if he were lying beneath the cornerstone looking up through layers of dirt and stone. Above him the pagoda rose, stretching toward a sky he could no longer see. Faces hovered around him, small faces, wide-eyed, lips moving in silent accusation. Each night more faces joined them, crowding into the narrow space of his imagination. When he woke, he often found his hands clenched around fistfuls of his mat, fingers aching as if they had been straining against invisible weight. Some villagers claimed to hear knocking beneath the ground when they passed near the site. At first, they dismissed it as shifting stones, the natural settling of a massive structure. But the sounds became too rhythmic, too purposeful. A sequence of knocks, then a pause, then another sequence, as if someone or many someones were attempting to communicate from below. The villagers responded the only way they knew, by leaving offerings near the base of the pagoda. Small bowls of rice, garlands of flowers, little carved toys they hoped the unseen children might recognize. The offerings were always gone by morning. Animals could have been the reason, or the wind, or the workers, yet the villagers preferred to believe the lost children were being fed in some small way. It made the terror slightly easier to bear. As the upper tiers of the pagoda began to take shape, the rituals became more frequent. The astrologers declared that each stage required its own binding. The first had secured the foundation, the second would secure the walls, the third would anchor the spire that would eventually crown the structure with a gleam of gold visible for miles. With each new stage, more rites, more vessels, more symbolic offerings of what could no longer be denied, the belief that only the restless dead could keep the living safe. The line between symbol and reality blurred further when an accident occurred on the scaffolding. A worker, steady and experienced, slipped from a height that should have spelled his end. Those nearby saw his body reel backward into empty space, yet instead of plummeting straight to the ground, they witnessed a strange, jerking halt in his fall, as if unseen hands had seized him mid-air.
He crashed against the lower tier rather than the earth, badly bruised, but alive. Later, when he spoke of the incident in a shaking voice, he said he had felt fingers closing around his ankles, cold as river mud, not pulling down, but holding him up. That story traveled through the village with unsettling speed. Some took it as proof that the pagoda's guardians were indeed protecting the structure and the people around it. Others shuddered at the idea that their safety rested in the grasp of spirits who had never been given a choice. The worker himself never again climbed the upper levels, claiming that every step he took near the top felt like stepping on someone's chest. The king, informed of both the accident and the miraculous survival, was pleased. For him, it confirmed what the astrologers had promised. The structure was binding the land, taming unseen forces to his will. He ordered more resources poured into the project, more workers conscripted, more food diverted to the site. The architect watched this with a hollow resignation. Each new influx of labor meant more potential offerings to the unseen hunger beneath the stones. As the pagoda rose, the village's relationship with it twisted into a strange dependence. They feared it, yet they also began to weave its existence into their expectations. When a storm broke early and spared the crops, some elders credited the new guardian. When a sickness passed quickly through the village without claiming as many lives as predicted, people left extra incense at the base of the pagoda. The structure became both captor and protector, jailer and shield. It loomed over them like a giant with blood on its hands and a promise on its lips. The forest did not remain silent in the face of this transformation. Trees closest to the clearing grew twisted, their trunks bending subtly away from the structure as if trying to recoil. Birds made sudden detours in their flight paths, arcing wide around the pagoda instead of passing overhead. At night, animals cried out in short, sharp bursts, as if startled by something that moved where nothing should be. Hunters reported that game grew scarcer near the site. Tracks would lead confidently towards the clearing, then abruptly disappear, as though animals simply ceased to exist at the edge of the pagoda's shadow. The river, too, seemed altered. Its surface near the village grew glassy on certain days, reflecting the pagoda with unnerving clarity. On other days, it churned and darkened without any visible cause. Fishermen began to mutter that the river no longer belonged entirely to them. They felt watched from the depths. Some claimed to see pale shapes drifting just below the surface, not fish, not floating leaves, but outlines like hands reaching upward and then dissolving.
In the midst of all this, the architect continued his work. He adjusted angles, inspected supports, ensured that each new tier was correctly aligned. Outwardly, he did everything expected of his position. Inwardly, a part of him was crumbling. He had come to understand that the pagoda was no longer merely a monument to the king's ambition. It had become something else, a convergence point where belief had become action and action had become consequence. Each ritual tied another knot between the structure and the lives around it, tightening an invisible web that now spanned foundation, villagers, forest, river, and sky. There were moments when he considered sabotage, imagined loosening supports or miscalculating angles to doom the pagoda to eventual collapse. But then he remembered the tales the astrologers had woven about what happens when a bound spirit is denied its purpose. A structure promised a soul and then deprived of it was said to turn its rage outward, collapsing not inward, but in a way that flung its curse across the land. He did not know if he believed those stories entirely, yet as he heard the faint knocks beneath the stone and saw the way the structure responded to each ritual, he felt too afraid to find out whether the tales were mere superstition or accurate warnings. And so the pagoda continued to rise, fed by offerings and fear. The blood that bound stone was seldom seen, but always felt. It existed in the empty houses of missing children, in the quiet sobbing muffled behind closed doors, in the way mothers now counted their children repeatedly at dusk, as if expecting one to vanish the moment they looked away. It existed in the bone-deep exhaustion of the workers and in the architect's haunted eyes. Above all, it existed in the foundations, in the packed earth beneath the cornerstone, where symbols and souls had mingled into a knot of power that no one could see but everyone could sense.
There, beneath layers of stone and ritual, something was changing. It was subtle, like the first shiver before a tremor, a tension, a coiling, a readiness. The pagoda, once just a framework of bricks and intentions, had begun to feel like a living presence. Soon the king would order the uppermost tiers and the gilded finial. Soon the tallest part of the structure would scrape the sky and cast its longest shadow yet. And when that happened, the forces bound beneath might no longer be content to remain only guardians. They might begin to demand more. They might begin to speak. What no one yet understood was that the price paid in blood and absence did not end with the completion of the pagoda. It would echo forward through storms and generations until someone dared to listen closely enough to the whispers coming from under the stone and ask the question everyone had been too terrified to voice. What exactly had they invited into the heart of their land? The king's palace rose like a jewel above the river, glittering with gold leaf and lacquered pillars. Yet beneath all that splendor lived a man whose heart was forever restless. For months now, his dreams had been plagued by visions, shadows slipping across the floor of his chamber, a child's laughter echoing from the rafters, and a pagoda rising higher and higher, its foundation dripping with something darker than water. At first, he dismissed these dreams as fatigue, the burden of ruling a vast kingdom where war lingered always at the borders and the monsoon season threatened famine each year. But as the dreams grew sharper, more vivid, he began to believe they were not dreams at all. They were warnings. The astrologers confirmed this belief by cloaking their words in ominous phrases, insisting the kingdom teetered on the brink of spiritual imbalance. There was unrest beneath the land, they claimed, a disturbance older than the court, older than the king's lineage, older even than the temples that lined the riverbank. It was this disturbance, they insisted, that would be calmed by the pagoda rising in the jungle. Only with the right balance of offerings, visible and invisible, could the kingdom avoid catastrophe. The king, whose reign had been marked by both brilliance and brutality, seized on these pronouncements with desperation. For years he had feared collapse, not merely structural, but political. Rivals whispered behind screens. Governors plotted alliances with foreign rulers. The people in the outer provinces spoke of revolts sparked by poor harvests. In his mind, everything was connected. The land's instability, the shifting loyalty of his subjects, the trembling stars above, and the restless dreams that pulled him from sleep. A grand pagoda, one that touched the sky and anchored his legacy, became his answer to everything. The astrologers had told him that such a structure would stabilize not only the earth, but the kingdom's fate. But they had also told him that such a structure demanded more than stone. Thus the king became complicit long before he realized the depth of the rituals. At first, he asked few questions about the rites performed at the pagoda site, trusting the astrologers' assurances that everything taken was necessary. But as disappearances increased and strange reports filtered back to the capital, he began to sense the edges of the truth. He heard whispers of children vanishing into the forest, of offerings sealed beneath cornerstone, of workers waking at night to the sound of soft tapping from below the earth. These rumors should have disturbed him deeply, yet instead they stirred a different emotion within him: awe. The idea of binding restless spirits to protect his reign grew intoxicating. If restless souls could be yoked to stone, perhaps they could be yoked to destiny. Perhaps fate itself could be tethered, like an ox led by a rope. And yet, beneath each breath of excitement lay a thin thread of fear, invisible but ever present. When he finally visited the pagoda site, escorted by dozens of soldiers and advisors, he expected to see ordinary construction: dust, sweat, stone, and tools. Instead, he felt the weight of the place settle over him like a shroud. The jungle around the clearing seemed tense, crouched, watching. The air felt dense, full of vibrations that urged him to turn back, but pride pushed him forward. As he stepped closer, the workers dropped to their knees, their faces strained from more than just labor. The astrologers greeted him with reverence, though their eyes carried a feverish gleam, as though they had glimpsed something no mortal should and survived only barely. The king approached the foundation, gazing down at the sealed stone. For a moment he thought he saw the faintest ripple run across the surface. It could have been sunlight, or something shifting beneath. He told himself it was merely the weight of the structure settling into place, but when he touched the stone and felt a faint pulse, slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, he recoiled before he could stop himself. His advisors saw nothing unusual, but the architect, standing apart with hollow eyes, seemed to understand the king's reaction. Their gazes met for a brief moment, laden with a silent, shared terror. The astrologers swept in quickly, chanting, placing protective charms around the king. They explained nothing, yet their actions hinted that they had expected such a reaction. The king withdrew his hand and flexed his fingers, as though testing whether they still belonged to him. As he toured the site, he could not ignore the way villagers avoided looking at him directly. Their fear clung to the air like smoke, thick and choking. He sensed blame in their silence, resentment in their lowered gazes. He knew that a ruler needed the fear of his subjects, but there was a difference between fear of authority and fear of death. He sensed the latter in abundance here. That night, he remained near the site, sleeping in a silk-draped pavilion erected for his visit. Though he was guarded by soldiers and surrounded by the comforts of royalty, he could not rest. The jungle hummed with strange noises, rustling leaves, distant calls, and at times whispers that seemed too articulate to be natural. He lay tense beneath his blankets, staring into the darkness. At the edge of sleep, he heard it. A thin, wavering voice floating from the direction of the pagoda. It was high and soft, like a child's lullaby. Another voice joined it, the harmonies weaving a melody too beautiful to be human, too sorrowful to be anything but a lament. His blood chilled. He forced himself still, listening as the song grew louder, spiraling upward toward the night sky.
He wanted to tell himself he had imagined it, but morning brought confirmation. The soldiers assigned to guard the perimeter had not slept. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They murmured among themselves of seeing figures at the edge of the trees, small, pale silhouettes that moved like drifting mist. The king demanded the astrologers explain these sightings. They bowed low, their expressions unreadable. They told him the spirits were stirring, drawn by the rising structure. They said the pagoda required further rites to ensure the spirits remained bound and did not wander freely. This explanation unsettled him, but it also fed his need for control. If the spirits could be bound, then so could destiny. When he returned to the capital, he brought with him a heightened resolve to finish the pagoda at any cost. He issued new decrees, more workers, more materials, more oversight from the palace. The structure must rise faster, taller, stronger. The astrologers encouraged this fervor, whispering of omens that demanded urgency. Meanwhile, in the village, the mood darkened even further. Instead of fearing that the king might not know the truth, the villagers now feared he knew too much, that he had sanctioned the horror growing at the edge of their forest. Their grief turned to a quiet, simmering hatred. They watched the pagoda climb higher as their children's laughter faded from memory. The architect felt this hatred most keenly. He walked the village paths like a man condemned. Every glance directed at him weighted with accusation. Though he had never directly participated in the kidnappings, he felt responsible for every life the pagoda demanded. He had designed the structure. He had bowed to the astrologer's instructions. He had handed over the clay figurine, and now the pagoda rose like a monument to his guilt, tier upon tier of stone stacked atop the bones of innocence. He tried to speak with the astrologers, begged them to reconsider the rituals, but the astrologers were beyond reason. They had become zealots, convinced that they were shaping history through sacrifice. They believed the pagoda would become a spiritual engine, stabilizing not just the land, but the cosmos itself. They spoke as though the missing children had transcended into something sacred, as though their absence were a holy offering. Yet even they feared what lay beneath the cornerstone. They never approached it alone. They avoided the foundation at dusk. More than once the architect saw them pause during rituals, glancing downward as if listening. Something had begun to respond from beneath, something that did not sound content to be merely bound.
Storms grew more violent as the pagoda rose. Monsoon winds tore through the village with unusual ferocity, uprooting trees and sending debris flying like weapons. During one such storm, lightning struck the river, illuminating a ghostly procession of pale shapes drifting just beneath the surface. A fisherman watching from the shore swore he saw faces, children's faces, emerging from the water before dissolving into ripples. The king received these reports but dismissed them as exaggerated tales born of fear. He believed only in the astrologers' reassurances. He believed the storms were the land's reaction to being reshaped, and that the pagoda would quell them once completed. In his mind, the kingdom was on the cusp of a new era, an era where the spirits, tamed and bound, would serve the throne forever. But the architect saw deeper. He sensed a shift in the air, a change in the way the pagoda responded to offerings. The foundation no longer felt as though it were being satisfied. Instead, it felt restless, expectant, hungry. One evening, as he inspected the lower tiers, he noticed a faint crack running down the side of the foundation, so thin it would be invisible to anyone else. When he placed his fingertips lightly against it, he felt warmth, not from the stone absorbing sunlight, but from something beneath, something alive. He jerked his hand back and stumbled away, his heart pounding. The crack pulsed once, just once, like a heartbeat. The realization settled over him like a shroud. The pagoda was no longer a prison for bound souls. It was becoming something else, something with its own will, something born from stone and sacrifice, shaped by fear and obedience. And the king, in his desperation to bind destiny, had unknowingly forged a bargain not with spirits, but with the dead themselves. The monsoon announced itself not with rain, but with a silence so absolute that even the insects seemed to retreat into the cracks of the trees. It was an unnatural stillness, thick and heavy, covering the forest like a damp cloth. The villagers felt it first, raising their heads mid-task as the air fell strange and hollow around them. Birds fled the canopy in frantic bursts, vanishing into distant skies as though escaping something far greater than an approaching storm. The river slowed, then stilled, its surface flattening into a mirror that reflected the tense sky with eerie clarity. Then the wind rose. It did not start as a breeze, but as a single low groan sweeping through the treetops. Leaves twisted on their stems, branches bowed, and children clung to their mothers as the gusts strengthened. The villagers retreated indoors, clutching lanterns that flickered wildly, casting long shadows on the bamboo floors. The elders murmured prayers, their low chants trembling with fear. They had seen storms like this only in the darkest years of the kingdom's past, storms that carried omens, storms that followed great wrongdoing. On the hill where the half-finished pagoda rose, the workers scrambled to secure tools and lash scaffolding. The structure, once serene in its ascension, now looked like a wounded giant bracing itself against an invisible enemy. The sky churned above it, deepening from gray to bruised purple, then to a pitch-black mass that swallowed the horizon. Thunder boomed, rolling across the jungle like a drum of war. The architect stood at the foot of the pagoda, his cloak whipping violently around him. He knew this storm was no ordinary monsoon. He felt it in the ground beneath his feet, where the earth vibrated subtly, too subtly for natural quakes, but too intentional to dismiss. Something beneath the foundation seemed to push upward, as though sensing weakness in the sky above. Each tremor felt like a slow inhale, anticipation coiling tighter and tighter. He turned his gaze upward. The pagoda's tiers, still incomplete, swayed ever so slightly, not enough to collapse, but enough to warn him. He felt sweat slide down his back despite the wind's chill. He had lived through many monsoon seasons, but none made him feel as though the land itself might crack open and release something ancient and furious. As lightning cleaved the sky into blinding shards, the first raindrops finally fell, heavy, oversized, like pebbles hurled from the heavens. They struck the ground with dull thumps, darkening the soil in irregular patches. Within seconds, the drizzle swelled into a torrent. The workers abandoned their tasks, fleeing toward the forest edge where makeshift shelters awaited them. The architect lingered a moment longer, staring at the pagoda as the rain hammered against it. Then he heard it, faint, muffled, unmistakable, knocking from beneath the foundation. It came in short, uneven beats, like frantic fists against a sealed door. The architect stumbled backwards, slipping in the mud, his heart racing. The storm roared around him, masking the sound from everyone else, but he knew what he had heard. The knocks were not from shifting stone. They were too rhythmic, too desperate. Thunder cracked again, so loud it seemed to split the forest. Trees bent violently, their roots exposed, as the ground began to liquefy into sludge. The architect turned and ran, the rain battering his face, the wind pushing against him like an enemy determined to keep him close to the pagoda.
Down in the village, chaos reigned. The floodwaters rose with unnatural speed, rushing between huts, sweeping away baskets, mats, even livestock. The villagers screamed above the wind, scrambling to move their belongings to higher ground. The river had overflowed countless times in the past, but never like this. It surged inward with the violence of a living thing, carrying debris and branches, and, for a chilling moment, what looked like pale shapes drifting just beneath the surface. Lanterns flickered out, roofs peeled away like leaves pulled from stems. Boats moored at the riverbank were ripped free and carried off into the raging current. Yet through all this, one sound rose above the storm. The low, mournful humming that the workers had reported hearing at night. It threaded through the wind, weaving around huts, slipping beneath doors and through thin walls. It was unlike any human voice, yet full of sorrow so deep it seems to crack the air itself. The villagers recognized it instantly. The lost children. The humming grew louder as the storm intensified, swirling through the village like a lament carried on the breath of the storm. Fathers pressed their hands over their children's ears. Mothers clutched their babies to their chests. The elders prostrated themselves and begged the spirits for mercy. The architect, arriving drenched and trembling, staggered into the center of the village just as a bolt of lightning illuminated the hill where the pagoda stood. For a brief instant, the entire structure glowed in stark silhouette, and the architect saw movement along its tiers. Small figures, pale, wavering, indistinct, like mist caught in the shape of children. They crawled along the stone as though pulled from below, their limbs bending at angles no living joints could mimic. Lightning flashed again, and the figures vanished. But the architect knew he was not hallucinating. Something within the pagoda had stirred in response to the storm. As the wind shrieked through the trees, the astrologers arrived in the village, their ceremonial robes plastered to their bodies by the rain. They pushed through the terrified crowd, shouting instructions that were swallowed by thunder. Their faces were masks of panic, stripped of their calm devotion they typically wore.
The storm had shaken even their fanatical certainty. The villagers watched in horror as the astrologers climbed the hill, braving the wind like desperate men racing to seal a breach in a dam. They reached the pagoda, disappearing into the sheets of rain. Moments later, cascades of chanting poured from the hill, not steady chants, but frantic ones, broken, rushed, drenched in fear.
The architect forced himself forward, step by agonizing step, drawn by a terror that made him feel hollow inside. When he reached the base of the hill, he crouched behind a tree to shield himself from the wind and stared upward. The astrologers were circling the pagoda, holding charms aloft, stamping symbols into the mud. They shouted toward the foundation as though addressing someone or something beneath the stone. The ground trembled violently, shaking mud loose in sliding sheets. One astrologer fell, only to be dragged backward by invisible force. His hands clawed into the mud, leaving deep furrows as he was pulled toward the pagoda's base. Another astrologer seized him by the robe, but his grip slipped. The man was yanked toward the cornerstone, disappearing behind a wave of earth that surged upward like a living tide. The architect's scream was eaten by thunder. The village saw little of what happened next, but they heard it. A low rumble that vibrated in their bones, a deep, resonant cracking that suggested the earth itself was splitting open. The storm, if possible, grew wilder, as though answering the cries of the dead. Several villagers reported seeing faint glows beneath the pagoda. Others claimed to see shadows slipping in and out of the tiers, like spirits searching for escape. The storm pressed against the land with unrelenting fury, pushing everyone into hiding. The village became a tangle of panicked voices, splashing footsteps, and prayers choked by rain. When dawn finally broke, the storm retreated in a slow, reluctant withdrawal. Rain diminished into drizzle. Wind thinned into whispers. The sky brightened, revealing a world drowned and broken. The villagers emerged cautiously, stepping into muddy pools that had swallowed half their homes. The river had reshaped its banks, claiming new territory as though asserting dominance. The architect climbed the hill with dread weighing heavily on his limbs. Blood seeped from his bitten lip where he had clamped it shut through the storm's worst moments. His heart thudded with terror as he approached the pagoda. He froze. The pagoda, though battered by the storm, still stood, stronger even. The cracks he had seen the day before were gone, sealed seamlessly as though the stone had healed itself. Mud coated its lower tiers, but the structure looked strangely nourished, as though the storm had not battered it, but fed it. But the astrologers, those who had not fled, were gone. Only their ceremonial robes remained tangled among roots and scattered across the foundation stones. A few lay draped over the mud like abandoned skins. The architect felt tremors shudder through his hands. The storm had taken them, or the pagoda had. Yet the worst discovery came from the cornerstone. The soil before it had been disturbed, not by rain, but by something pushing outward from beneath. The surface bulged slightly, as though something inside the earth had swelled, pressing upward, longing to break free. And faint, barely audible, vibrating through the morning air like a half-forgotten lullaby, the whispers had grown louder. The architect sank to his knees as he realized the truth he had long feared but never voiced. The spirits beneath the pagoda were no longer content to guard. The storm had awakened them. They were testing their prison, and soon they would want more. The storm had passed, but the air refused to clear. It clung to the skin like damp cloth, heavy and unmoving, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The villagers felt it in the slow drag of time, in the reluctance of the birds to return to their perches, in the oppressive silence that followed their prayers. Even the river moved differently, its current pulling against itself, as though confused about which direction to flow. Something had shifted. Something had awakened beneath the pagoda, and though no one spoke of it aloud, every soul in the village felt the tremors of a presence stretching after a long, restless sleep.
Into this stillness came the monk. He arrived by the southern path with nothing more than a weathered satchel, a staff polished by years of use, and a calmness that seemed at odds with the trembling world around him. His robes, simple, travel-worn, foreign, marked him as an outsider from the moment children spotted him walking slowly toward the village. His shaved head glistened faintly with sweat under the morning light, and his steps carried the steady rhythm of a man who had walked a very long way and would continue walking long after this village swallowed him into its silence. No one greeted him at first. The villagers watched from behind doors and half-lifted curtains, their eyes narrowed with caution. Outsiders rarely came to this place. Outsiders never came during monsoon season, and outsiders certainly did not appear after a storm that had nearly torn the land in two. The monk raised his hand in a gentle gesture of peace, but the villagers only retreated further. Fear had soaked into their bones, leaving little space for trust. Eventually, a few elders approached him, but only because ignoring a lone monk felt like tempting fate. The architect, exhausted and still shaken by the events on the hill, stood among them. When he saw the monk's eyes, calm yet piercing, something inside him tightened. Those eyes did not belong to someone seeking shelter. They belonged to someone who already knew too much. The monk observed the village slowly, taking in the collapsed huts, the scattered belongings, the faces carrying grief like a second skin. He noticed the way children clung to their parents, the way mothers kept glancing toward the Pagoda Hill, the way the architect stood like a man hollowed by guilt. He recognized suffering the way a healer recognizes illness. It emanated from the village like heat from smoldering embers. After a short rest, he walked toward the river to refresh himself. The villagers watched him go, some curious, others fearful. They whispered that the river had become cursed since the storm, that pale shapes drifted beneath its surface when no one was looking directly at it. The monk paid no heed to whispers. He knelt by the riverbank, cupped water in his hands, and paused. Something moved beneath the water. Not a fish, not debris, something too pale, too slow, drifting with unnatural grace. His breath stilled. He did not recoil, but leaned closer, focusing on the faint reflection beneath the surface, a shape that looked like the curve of a small face dissolved into ripples. Another flicker of pale movement slid past the muddy riverbed. The monk lowered his hands, letting the water slip away. When he rose, he looked toward the hill with a grim certainty that sent a murmur of unease through the villagers watching from afar. He climbed the hill alone. The path was slick with mud, the air filled with the smell of wet earth and shattered foliage. Fallen branches snagged his robe, but he moved steadily, unhurried, as though guided by some inner compass. When he reached the pagoda, he paused. Even unfinished, its presence loomed immense. The monk approached its base, stepping carefully around scattered debris and the remnants of the astrologer's robes strewn like abandoned skins. The architect, after a moment of hesitation, followed him. The rest of the villagers remained at the foot of the hill, unwilling to climb closer to the place where the storm had swallowed men whole. The monk examined the foundation stones with a deliberate, practiced eye. He pressed his palm lightly against the cold surface. A faint vibration traveled up his arm, subtle, rhythmic, wrong. The monk closed his eyes. His lashes trembled as though sensing far more than physical texture. When he withdrew his hand, he exhaled slowly, and the architect felt dread coil tightly in his stomach. The monk knelt near the bulging patch of earth in front of the cornerstone. His fingers brushed the soil gently, tracing the disturbance with the care of someone handling an open wound. He scooped away a small handful of mud. Beneath it, something pale and brittle protruded, so small it could have been overlooked entirely. A fragment of bone. The architect's knees nearly gave out when he saw it. It was unmistakably human, small enough to belong to a child. The monk lifted the fragment with reverence, studying its faint curvature. The architect expected horror, outrage, or shock, but instead he saw sorrow, deep and heavy, settling like dust on the monk's face.
The monk placed the bone gently onto a stone slab, his movements slow, respectful. Then he began examining the ground further, clearing away more mud with patient strokes. Several more fragments surfaced, each one clean washed by the storm, each one evidence of lives taken and buried beneath the foundation. The architect's breath came sharp and shallow, his vision blurred. He had always known what the rituals meant, but seeing the bones, seeing them exposed to air and daylight, shattered the thin veil of denial he had wrapped himself in. The monk rose and faced him. There were no accusations in the monk's expression, only a quiet understanding that cut deeper than any condemnation. A man who had walked many lands, witnessed many horrors, and seen the lengths to which rulers would go to preserve their power. The architect felt the truth settle heavily between them. The pagoda was no longer just a symbol of ambition. It was a grave, a prison, a vessel holding restless souls whose suffering had been bound to stone. The monk circled the pagoda slowly, observing how the cracks that once threatened the structure had healed themselves. He paused at each tier, pressing his hand against the surface and listening. The architect saw tension ripple through the monk's shoulders with each touch, as though the merest contact with the pagoda burdened him with the voices trapped within. When the monk returned to the base, he sank into silence for a long while. The wind stirred weakly, as though afraid to breathe too loudly. At last, the monk glanced toward the villagers below, tiny figures watching with anxious eyes, before turning to the architect. Without speaking, the monk touched 2 fingers to the foundation stone. Something answered. A low, resonant vibration pulsed through the earth, not violent, not chaotic, but unmistakably alive. It rolled beneath the soil like a trapped breath, pushing against the boundaries of its confinement. The monk stepped back abruptly, his calm composure disrupted for the first time since his arrival. His chest rose sharply, his face stiffened, as though he had touched a hot surface. Beneath the pagoda, something had stirred in response to him. The architect trembled. He knew the monk had awakened a reaction that even the astrologers had not provoked. Perhaps the spirits sensed purity in him, a living presence uncorrupted by fear or guilt, or perhaps they sensed danger. The monk now represented a threat to the very binding that kept them imprisoned. The monk turned his gaze toward the sky, where dark clouds still loomed in the distance, remnants of the monstrous storm. His face hardened with resolve. He began to walk down the hill, and the architect followed him in a daze.
When they reached the village, the monk finally spoke, not with words, but with action. He opened his satchel and carefully placed the small bone fragments inside, treating them not as evidence of horror, but as relics deserving of respect. The villagers watched in fearful silence as he arranged them with great care. Though he had not spoken a word, they understood what he intended. He would give the lost children peace, but peace for them could only come at a cost, the undoing of the bindings that held their spirits captive. And if the bindings were undone, what else would be released? The villagers sensed the danger before anyone else voiced it, stepping back instinctively. The monk, however, did not flinch. He looked toward the pagoda with a calm born of deep spiritual training, but the architect saw the shadow of dread in his eyes. Even the monk had felt the depth of what was buried beneath that stone. That night, the monk lit a small fire outside the village and prepared the bone fragments for purification rites. The villagers gathered at a distance, huddled together under blankets, whispering among themselves. The architect approached and sat a few feet from the monk, feeling the heat of the fire and the coldness of the night seep into his bones at the same time. As the monk began chanting, soft,
steady, mournful. The wind rose in unnatural swirls. The fire crackled wildly, though no wood had been added. The villagers watched with wide, fearful eyes. The flames cast tall, flickering shadows that seemed to dance independently of their source. Then the air changed. The wind shifted direction. The flames bent toward the pagoda. A sobbing sound, thin, distant, yet unmistakably human, drifted down from the pagoda. The villagers gasped, clinging to one another. The monk's chant faltered for a fraction of a second, but he continued, voice now stronger, deeper, resonant with a force none of them had ever heard. The sobbing grew louder. Then came a new sound, a scraping, a dragging, a low, guttural groan from deep within the earth. The ground beneath them trembled, not violently, but insistently, like a warning. The architect felt sweat drip down his neck despite the cold. He realized the spirits trapped beneath the pagoda were reacting to the monk's rite, not with gratitude, but with fear or anger. The monk's voice rose in pitch, chanting faster, trying to soothe, trying to guide the lost souls. But the pagoda shuddered. A crack split the air, not stone cracking, but something deeper, something older. The villagers screamed as a sudden gust of icy wind swept across the clearing, snuffing out several lanterns. The fire dimmed to embers, fighting to stay alive. The monk stopped chanting. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Then from the pagoda hill, a whisper drifted down, clear, soft, impossibly close. A child's voice, followed by another and another, calling for release, calling for vengeance, calling names, names of the living, names of the dead. The monk's eyes widened with horrified understanding. The pagoda was no longer merely stirring, it was waking. For many years afterward, the villagers would remember that night not by the date, not by the position of the moon, but by the sound. Long after their memories of the king's decrees had faded, long after the shapes of the astrologers' faces had blurred into indistinct fear, the sound remained sharp and unforgettable. It was not thunder, though storms would come and go. It was not the howl of beasts in the jungle, though such cries peppered the nights of their childhood. It was something else, something that did not belong to sky or animal or any living throat. They called it, in hushed tones, the night the pagoda cried. The day before that night unfolded with a strange, brittle calm. The sky above Mandalay wore a pale, translucent blue, as if exhausted by the recent storm. The forest, though still damp, had begun to breathe again. Birds ventured cautiously back to their branches. The river, while fuller and darker than before, no longer churned in wild fits of confusion. Yet beneath this slow return to normalcy, a tension coiled in every shadow, like a rope drawn tight but not yet snapping. The monk remained near the village boundary, his small fire reduced to ash, the bone fragments purified and wrapped in cloth. He had not attempted another rite since the first had stirred such violent reactions. The architect often found him sitting in stillness, gazing toward the pagoda hill with an expression that combined resolve and helplessness. The villagers feared him a little, but it was the kind of fear reserved for those who dared to touch forces others would not even name. Work on the pagoda slowed, but did not stop. The king's orders hung over the project like a blade. Workers climbed the tiers with hesitant steps, each hammer strike echoing too loudly across the clearing. They flinched at every hollow thud that sounded as though it came not from stone, but from some deep, unseen chamber beneath. More than once they halted, looking to the architect for permission to leave, but his hollow eyes offered them no refuge. He urged them quietly onward, his voice dry, his conscience bleeding with every command. As the sun slipped toward the horizon that evening, the village sank into a quiet more profound than usual. No one lingered outside once dusk began to deepen. Doors were barred earlier, shutters tied closed. The elders urged extra incense to be burned on home altars. Mothers checked and rechecked that their children were inside, counting heads with a frantic precision born of too many losses. Even the dogs, usually so noisy at night, lay silently near thresholds, ears pricked but mouths closed. Above them, framed by the fading light, the pagoda stood against the sky, a dark shape that seemed less like a building and more like a colossal figure hunched in thought. Mist began to gather at its base, slicking the tears in a sheen of dampness that caught the last light and turned it into a dull, sickly glow. The architect, standing alone at the edge of the clearing, watched the structure with a tightness in his chest that mimicked the tightening of the earth beneath his feet. Night fell fully, swift and heavy, as if someone had lowered a lid over the world. The moon was hidden behind thick veils of cloud. Stars, if they existed, did so unseen. Only the faint glow of scattered lanterns in the village punctured the darkness. The jungle breathed softly all around, a rustle here, a crackle there, but even its sounds seemed subdued, wary. The first sign came as a vibration. It was so faint that, at first, no one noticed. The architect felt it as a subtle shiver beneath his soles, like the echo of a distant drum. The monk, sitting cross-legged just outside the village, felt it as a tremor through his bones, as though someone had touched the base of his spine. Children, already struggling to sleep, felt their mats twitch very slightly, as if something beneath the floor had shifted. Then came the second tremor, stronger, longer. Bowls rattled softly on shelves, a hanging charm tapped against a wooden beam. Water in clay pots rippled with delicate concentric rings. The villagers froze, hearts pounding, eyes drawn involuntarily toward the hill, though they could not see it clearly in the thick dark.
On the hill, the pagoda absorbed the tremor and responded. From deep within its foundation, a low sound began to rise. It was not yet a cry, not yet a wail. It was more like a groan, slow, straining, as if compressed air were forcing itself through narrow cracks. The sound vibrated through the stone, traveled into the soil, and rolled down the slope toward the village. It carried with it a chill that did not touch the skin so much as seep directly into the bones. The architect's breath hitched. He recognized this resonance. It was the same awareness he had glimpsed in dreams, the same pressure that had pulsed against his fingertips when he dared to touch the cornerstone. Only now it was louder, closer, less contained. Inside their huts, the villagers pressed together, listening as the groan shifted. It stretched into a long, drawn-out exhale, then snapped into silence. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hover in that absence of sound. Then the pagoda cried. It began as a single sound, high and thin, like a child swallowing a scream and failing. It emerged not from the jungle, not from the sky, but from the pagoda itself, from its stone body, its sealed foundation, its layers of ritual and bone. The cry threaded its way through mortar, squeezed between bricks, and spilled into the open air as a wavering, aching note that wrenched itself free and spread outward. The sound did not stay alone for long. A second cry joined it, slightly lower, slightly rougher, as though it belonged to a different throat, then another, and another. Soon there was a chorus of voices, layered over one another in eerie, dissonant harmony. Some were small, trembling, unmistakably the cries of children. Others sounded older, deeper, frayed by time and pain. The combined wail rose and fell, not in melody, but in a shifting tide of anguish that washed over the village and pressed against every heart. The villagers could no longer pretend to themselves that this was wind. Wind did not carry remembered patterns. Wind did not sob. Yet woven into the sound, if one listened closely enough, were fragments that stirred recognition, snatches of lullabies once sung in small huts, the rhythm of playful chants shared at the riverbank, half-remembered phrases shaped by familiar cadences.
The lost children were crying, but so were others. Voices no one recognized, voices perhaps buried in older, forgotten foundations far away. Huts that had always felt safe became thin shells incapable of keeping out the noise. The cries seeped through walls and roofs, pooling in corners like cold water. Children covered their ears and buried their faces in their mothers' laps, but the sound penetrated even the shelter of human embrace. The elders, whose bones ached with the weight of old stories, whispered prayers in quaking voices, words sticking to their tongues as though the very air resisted speech.
The monk rose to his feet and turned toward the hill, palms facing outward in a gesture of both defense and compassion. His training had prepared him to face grief, to guide the suffering across unseen thresholds. But this was not mere grief. It was a collective howl of souls wrenched from their rightful places and trapped beneath stone, forced into roles they had never chosen. The architect, halfway between the village and the hill, dropped to his knees. The sound tore through him, shredding the fragile layer of numbness he had built to survive. He heard in those cries not only the children he had failed to save, but the echo of his own guilt. Each wail seemed to carry a wordless question. Why? The question burrowed into him like splinters, each one sharp, each one deserved. The earth shuddered again, harder this time. Dust sifted down from rafters. A jar toppled over and smashed. Dogs began to whine, then fell silent, their instincts overwhelmed by whatever pressed down from above and up from below. The pagoda's cry rose in pitch, the sound growing thinner, more strained, as if the unseen throats were scraping against the limits of their prison. On the hill, stones shifted. The bulging patch of earth by the cornerstone began to heave in small, jerking motions, as though something beneath it were pounding upward with weakened fists. Faint cracks appeared in the hard-packed surface, thin white lines that widened with each tremor. At the edges of the foundation, dust cascaded down in pale curtains, turning the air ghostly. From within the pagoda's body, new sounds joined the cries. The scrape of something dragging against stone, the hollow thud of impacts from inside walls, the unsettling rattle of what might have been bone knocking against brick. The structure moaned under its own weight, not with the natural protest of aging stone, but with the voice of something that had been asked to bear too much suffering and had finally found a way to object. The villagers could no longer stay inside. Compelled by terror and curiosity in equal measure, they opened their doors and stepped into the night. The cries enveloped them fully now, swirling around their heads, echoing in their chests. Some fell to their knees at once, hands over their faces. Others clutched charms and talismans, holding them up as feeble shields. They looked up at the hill and saw it, though no torches were lit, though the night remained thick. The pagoda glowed faintly, not with external light, but from within. It was as if a coal smoldered at its center, illuminating cracks and edges with a dull, reddish tone. The glow pulsed in time with the rhythm of the cries. With each wave of sound, the light swelled, then faded, then swelled again. The monk began to chant. Not a binding chant, not a ritual of command like those the astrologers had used, but a slow, sorrowful invocation meant to soothe the dead. His voice cut through the cries in a different way. It did not overpower them, but rather moved among them, offering a path. He called not for obedience, but for release. His words carried reverence, acknowledging the pain, recognizing the unjust weight forced upon those below. For a moment, the cries faltered. The glow within the pagoda flickered, dimming slightly. The earth seemed to relax beneath the villagers' feet. A fragile hush draped itself over the night, thin as silk, easily torn. Then something resisted. A deeper note surged from beneath the foundation, slower, heavier, dragging. It was not the voice of a child, nor of a single adult.
It was a conglomerate, a mass, the sound of many voices fused into one. It boomed through the stone, vibrated in the soil, and smothered the monk's chant. The cries of individual spirits were swallowed into it, transformed into a single resonant roar of anguish and rage. The monk staggered, breath punched from his lungs. The architect, watching this, realized the dreadful truth. The spirits were no longer just many. The rituals, the bindings, the storm, these had melded them into something else. A collective presence, born of their shared suffering, now spoke with one voice, and that voice was stronger than any rite meant to quiet it. The pagoda's glow intensified. Fine cracks raced along its tiers like veins of lightning, carrying the faint reddish light through stone that had seemed impenetrable only days before. Dust rained down in small storms. The air filled with a dry, acrid smell, like ancient incense burned to ash and forced to rise again. Then, for the first time, the pagoda wept. From narrow seams in the stone, places where mortar had been pressed too hurriedly, where bricks sat imperfectly, thin trails of dark moisture began to seep. At first, it looked like rainwater squeezed from tired joints, but rain had not fallen that night, and the liquid was too thick, too slow, its color too dark in the faint glow of the inner light. It slid down the tiers in narrow rivulets, tracing the lines of carvings and pooling in small depressions. On the lower levels, it gathered into shallow puddles that glistened with an almost metallic sheen. The monk stared at it, his stomach twisting. The architect took a step back, bile rising in his throat. The villagers, even from a distance, sensed what it symbolized. The pagoda, fed with sacrifice, now exuded the memory of it, a physical echo of the blood and tears poured into its making. The cries reached a peak, then fractured into sobs, then into broken gasps. It was as though the spirits had screamed themselves hoarse. The glow inside the stone flickered rapidly, erratic and unstable. The ground shook in short, violent bursts, each one sending loose pebbles skittering, each one threatening to topple unsteady structures in the village. Children cried openly now, their living voices mingling with the anguish of the dead. Mothers clutched them tight, whispering apologies into their hair, apologies meant not only for their own children, but for all the children the village had failed to protect. Fathers stared at the hill with hollow eyes, seeing not a royal monument, but a towering accusation. The monk, regaining his balance, resumed his chant, not louder this time, but softer, deeper, threading his voice carefully around the roar. He could not silence what had awakened, but he could offer it guidance, a direction in which to pour its pain. He called upon mercy not from the pagoda, but for those trapped within it. He acknowledged their rage, their sorrow, their abandonment. He did not deny the injustice, he named it. For a long moment, nothing seemed to change. Then, gradually, the cries began to shift. They did not fade, but their pitch altered, thinning from raw wails into something more like keening, a sorrow still sharp, but less explosive. The glow within the pagoda steadied, no longer flaring wildly. The trembling of the ground settled into a low, constant vibration, like a deep sigh that refused to end. The rivulets on the stone slowed, then stopped. The pooled liquid at the base of the pagoda lay still, dark and opaque, reflecting nothing of the night sky. The architect sank cross-legged into the mud, his body too exhausted to stand. He stared blankly ahead, his mind echoing with the sound of the cries. He knew, with a clarity that felt like pain, that there would be no going back. The illusion that this was mere superstition had shattered. The pagoda was alive now in a way no one had intended. It housed not just memory, but will. When at last the cries dissolved into silence,
the village did not rejoice. The absence of sound felt heavier than the noise had. Ears rang with the ghost of it. Hearts pounded as if still running from a danger that had not yet fully revealed itself. The night remained without stars, without moon, without comfort.
Slowly, people retreated back inside, not because they felt safe, but because their bodies could no longer bear wakefulness. Children fell into uneasy sleep, whimpering. Elders stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently. Every mind knew the same truth. Something had changed between the pagoda and the land. A boundary had been tested, perhaps crossed. Only 3 figures remained outside long after the others had gone. The monk, sitting with his hands resting on his knees. The architect, huddled like a man on the edge of a fracture. And the pagoda, looming above them, its silhouette darker than the night around it. The monk spoke quietly into the darkness, not as conversation, but as a simple truth offered to the night, that bindings so cruel never last without consequence. The architect, though he could not hear every word, understood the meaning. The kingdom had tried to bargain with the dead, and the dead had finally found their voice. When dawn's first light came creeping over the horizon, pale and reluctant, it revealed a new sight. Hairline fractures traced the lower tiers of the pagoda like veins of frost. Small pieces of stone lay scattered at its base, fallen in the night. And in the soft morning mud at the foot of the hill, tiny footprints appeared where no living child had walked. Presses so shallow and fragile that the first touch of sun began already to erase them. The night the pagoda cried did not bring its collapse, but it marked the beginning of the end. Because once a prison starts to speak, it does not stay silent for long. By the time the crackling heat of dry season arrived, the village was no longer a place that breathed freely. Every sound seemed too loud, every shadow too deep, every shift of the earth a reminder of the night when the pagoda had cried. The villagers moved through their days as though wrapped in thick, invisible cloth, muffling even their thoughts. They no longer spoke of the lost children, not out of forgetfulness, but because their names felt too heavy to carry on the tongue. The king, however, felt none of this heaviness. In the distant capital, he received reports describing strange noises, worker unrest, and minor structural shifts. But the astrologers, those who remained, assured him that such disturbances were expected. They insisted the pagoda was adjusting to its spiritual burden. They did not speak of the storm that had swallowed men, nor of the footprints that appeared at dawn, nor of the crimson trails that had bled from the stone. They had long ago learned the king preferred certainties over truth, and so the truth was buried beneath the same layers of silence that had swallowed the children. Now, however, something far larger was rising. The earth had begun to change.
Day by day, villagers noticed that the ground around the pagoda trembled slightly, like the slow breathing of a sleeping giant. The vibrations were too subtle to topple anything, but constant enough to set the nerves on edge. At night, some swore they heard faint knocks beneath their mats, soft taps like distant heartbeats. A few swore they saw shapes moving in the mist, small, drifting silhouettes slipping between the trees. By mid-season, the trembling grew stronger. The architect, who had become thinner and more hollow-eyed with each passing week, felt the shifts most keenly. He had taken to sleeping near the foot of the hill, too frightened to rest in the village huts.
His dreams had become indistinguishable from waking nightmares, visions of stone chambers filled with cramped, twisting bodies, whispers slithering through cracks, and darkness pressing against his skin like damp soil. The monks stayed close to him. Sometimes they sat for hours without exchanging a single word, staring at the pagoda as one might stare at an approaching storm. The monk knew the bindings were weakening. He could sense the tug-of-war between the forces inside and the ancient rites that held them captive. It was no longer a question of if the pagoda would break. It was a question of how violent the breaking would be. The villagers, fearing another night of cries, began sleeping in groups. Families clustered together in large huts, huddling around lanterns that flickered even when no wind passed through the air. The animals grew restless, pacing in circles, refusing to graze near the hill. Several chickens died inexplicably, their bodies found in the morning with their eyes open, as though staring at something that had frightened them into stillness. The river offered its own warning. One night its waters glowed faintly with a pale luminescence, not enough to light the village, but enough for the villagers to see shimmering forms drifting beneath the surface, forms that looked like hands reaching upward, like faces turning toward the moonless sky. At dawn, the glow faded, leaving behind only murky water and quiet dread. Then came the day when the first stone fell. It happened at midday. Sun beat down on the pagoda, cracking the mud around its base. Workers had returned to try to salvage the upper tiers, though few believed anything could truly be repaired. The architect begged them to stay away, but orders from the capital forced the project onward. As they climbed the scaffolding, a tremor rippled through the pagoda. It was small, barely enough to sway the bamboo poles, but then a low groan echoed from within the stone. The sound carried through the clearing, freezing everyone in place. The workers exchanged terrified glances. One began to descend, only for the tremor to intensify. A crack raced across the third tier like lightning, splitting mortar with a sharp, dry snap. And then a stone, solid, heavy, immovable, shifted forward very slightly. Just an inch. But that inch sent every man on the scaffolding scrambling down like panicked insects. The villagers ran to gather at the base of the hill, mothers clutching their children, men gripping wooden staffs and farming blades as though they could fend off spirits with sharpened sticks. The monk and the architect moved together toward the pagoda, each feeling a pulse beneath their feet. Something beneath the structure was pushing upward. The tremors continued throughout the day. Dust poured from the cracks like falling ash. Birds that had dared to return fled again, filling the sky with frantic wings. The architect paced back and forth, wringing his hands, whispering to himself. The monk placed his palms on the earth and closed his eyes. When he opened them, his face was pale. The spirits were no longer testing their prison. They were breaking it. Night fell with a suffocating heaviness. The moon rose orange and swollen like an infected wound in the sky. Clouds swirled around it, though no wind stirred the trees. The villagers gathered near the fire pit in the center of the village, listening to the earth rumble quietly beneath them. Just after midnight, the rumbling stopped. Silence flooded the jungle, thick, absolute, unnatural. That was when the first scream came, not from a human throat, but from stone. A long, cracking wail tore through the night. The villagers screamed and dove to the ground as a shock wave rushed across the clearing. The pagoda glowed faintly from within, the crimson light returning with violent intensity. Cracks spiderwebbed down its base, splitting along the seams the architect had once designed with such care. Another scream erupted, deeper, older, filled with a fury that seemed to claw at the sky itself. The monks of distant temples would later say that the ground roared that night, that the spirits of the land cried out in unison, demanding justice. The pagoda shuddered violently. Stones tumbled, dust exploded outward in thick clouds. One of the upper tiers collapsed entirely, falling inward in a cascade of shattered brick. The glow intensified, as though something inside was burning with growing strength. The monk stepped forward despite the terror gripping the crowd. He raised his arms, chanting words not meant to bind or silence, but to guide. But the voices beneath the stone roared in response. They had no interest in guidance. Their cries were no longer pleas or warnings. They were demands. The architect ran to the monk's side, shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were wide, the whites showing all around the irises. He looked like a man finally forced to witness the full consequence of his complicity. When the ground buckled beneath them, he staggered but did not flee. The soil in front of the cornerstone bulged again, but this time it did not stop. With a sickening rupture, the ground cracked open. A mixture of earth, stone fragments, and dark liquids surged upward like a geyser. The villagers wailed, covering their eyes. Some fainted where they stood. And then, exposed to the night air, came the bones. Small bones, child-sized bones. They poured from the gap in a horrific cascade, tumbling over one another, clacking like wooden beads. The remains were stained with earth so dark it looked like dried blood. The villagers sobbed in terror and grief, recognizing bracelets and scraps of cloth among the bones, traces of children taken from them. But there were more. Larger bones, skulls, rib cages, limbs of adults whose fates had never been recorded. The pagoda housed more than the children. It housed the dead of older rituals, older shrines, older sacrifices the village had never known. A wave of cold wind rushed through the clearing. The pagoda convulsed inward, then collapsed. It did not crumble gently. It fell with violence, each tier imploding as though pulled downward by unseen hands. The villagers screamed as a cloud of dust and debris rose like a monstrous pillar, blotting out the moon. When it settled, the pagoda was a broken mound of shattered stone, its once majestic tiers reduced to ruin. The cries fell silent. The monk stood panting, staring at the heap of rubble. The architect fell to his knees and sobbed, his body shaking violently. The villagers approached the ruins cautiously, some crawling, some walking on trembling legs. There, in the center of the collapse, lay a hollow, a chamber, a dark, yawning cavity filled with bones, layer upon layer, packed so tightly together they formed a grotesque sculpture of suffering. The last of the crimson glow pulsed faintly from deep within the mass. Then went out. The jungle exhaled. The land grew still. The dead had forced their truth into the world, stripping away centuries of silence in a single catastrophic night. But the kingdom would pay a much greater price than the destruction of a single pagoda. Because now that the dead had been unbound, they would not rest until the living answered for what had been done to them. In the first days after the collapse, the ruins of the pagoda did not feel ancient. They felt freshly wounded, like a body split open to reveal the bones inside. Dust still hung in the air, mingling with the humid heat, drifting slowly down over shattered tiers and twisted fragments of stone. The villagers moved through that dust as though walking in a graveyard that had suddenly burst upward instead of sinking down. Every step felt like a trespass. Every breath carried the taste of earth that had been forced to give up what it had hidden for too long. The monk led them in rites as best he could. There were no prescribed rituals for this. A hill of bones dragged unwillingly into the open, the dead freed all at once from a prison they had not chosen. So he stitched together fragments of prayers from different places and paths, weaving them into something that might ease the weight of so much grief. The villagers gathered on their knees around the ruins, heads bowed, while the monk's voice rose and fell over the heap of remains. His chant did not pretend that what had been done was righteous. It did not seek to justify the rituals, the king's orders, or the choices of the astrologers. It simply recognized suffering, named wrongdoing, and asked the unseen to accept, at last, some measure of peace. The architect stood apart from the circle, just beyond the edge of the rites. His hands hung limp at his sides. His body still remembered the tremors of the collapse, the way the ground had lurched when the pagoda broke, the way the bones had poured out like a truth finally uncorked. He had spent so long trying not to see what he knew, and now he could not look away. Every skull, every limb, every small curved rib seemed to point toward him, accusing without words. No one blamed him aloud. The village had too many ghosts to chase to waste breath on a single man. But he wore their collective horror inside his ribs like a second, heavier skeleton.
The king did not come to see the ruins. From the safety of his palace, he received the news with narrowed eyes and tense shoulders. Messengers described the collapse as an earthquake, a structural failure, a miscalculation of stone. They spoke carefully, leaving out mention of the bones, the cries, the strange glow. The astrologers, diminished in number and authority, offered panicked explanations about unstable energies, misaligned stars, rites interrupted by storms. None of them dared to suggest that the spirits themselves had rejected their imprisonment. The king ordered the site sealed in his own way. It was not to be rebuilt. It was not to be discussed in official records. Scribes were instructed to omit mention of the Ghost Pagoda from royal chronicles, to smooth over the gap with phrases about temporary construction tests and reallocation of resources. The kingdom would have other monuments, other towers reaching for the sky. This one would be allowed to sink back into silence, if only in ink. But ink is not where stories live the longest. The villagers did not forget. They could not. The monk worked with them to gather the bones from the broken chamber, separating what could be distinguished from what had fused into the indistinct mass of time. They wrapped each fragment in cloth where they could, placed them in new graves in the forest and by the riverbank, in places touched by light and wind. The smallest remains were given particular care, buried beneath trees that would grow tall and wide, offering shade to future generations that would never know the names of the children resting beneath their roots. Not every bone could be claimed. Too many had been crushed, weathered, mingled. Those were left within the collapsed core of the pagoda, the rubble arranged around them in a circle marked with simple stones. No statues, no gold, no grand inscriptions. Only a quiet ring of rock and the memory of what lay beneath. The villagers began leaving offerings there in secret, bowls of rice, handfuls of flowers, small toys carved from wood, not as tribute to a king's monument, but as apology to the dead. Over time, the jungle began to reclaim the hill. Vines crept over broken tiers, moss softened sharp edges, small trees took root in cracks where mortar had once held fast. Rain filled shallow depressions, leaving mirrored puddles in which birds drank and insects danced. The ghosts did not vanish with the green growth, they simply changed the way they were felt. The cries that had once torn through the night softened into whispers, the heavy presence beneath the earth thinning into something lighter, more diffuse. People still avoided the hill at dusk, but they no longer did so with the same raw terror. It had become, slowly, a place of mourning rather than pure dread. The monk eventually moved on. His path, like all wandering paths, led him toward other villages, other griefs, other unseen burdens. But the echo of his chants lingered on the hill. The architect did not go with him. He remained in the village, a quieter figure than before,
his shoulders bent by invisible weight. Some said he spent hours sitting beneath a tree that grew atop the old foundation, staring at the stone circle and listening to the wind. Others whispered that he heard the dead more clearly than anyone else, that he spent the rest of his days asking forgiveness from voices only he could hear. In time, his name slipped out of common speech. He became part of the Hills story instead, a faceless figure in a cautionary tale about obedience, guilt, and the dangers of building towers on top of concealed bones. Years turned into decades. The king who had ordered the pagoda built died, as all kings do. His monuments elsewhere in the kingdom cracked under sun and rain, their gold fading, their inscriptions eroding. New rulers rose and fell, wars came and went, famine and flood danced their recurring pattern across the land. Yet the hill where the Ghost Pagoda had stood sank deeper into legend. Children were warned not to play near it, told that if they pressed their ears to the stones, they might hear the last sobs of those buried alive. Lovers snuck there at night to test their courage or swear promises beneath the tangled branches, only to leave with an unshakable sense that someone else was listening. Stories grew around the place, layer upon layer, the way moss layered itself over rock. Some said lights floated among the trees on certain nights, drifting like lanterns carried by invisible hands. Others said they had heard soft footsteps on the path behind them, light and quick, like those of children running, though no one ever appeared when they turned. A few claimed that those who slept too close to the hill woke with mud beneath their fingernails and the taste of dirt in their mouths, as if they had spent the night clawing their way upward from beneath the earth in dreams that did not feel entirely their own. The hill acquired a name that shifted with time, translated and reshaped across dialects and generations: Ghost Pagoda, Spirit Hill, the place where the children walk. No official marker bore these titles, yet everyone in the region knew them. Travelers passing through were warned in the same way one warns a guest about a loose step or a dangerous well, not with ceremony, but with heartfelt insistence. The ghosts were not vengeful toward the living without cause, people said, but the land remembered, and memory itself commands respect.
Centuries later, as foreign empires mapped the world and scholars began to arrive in Burma with notebooks and measuring instruments, the hill attracted a different kind of attention. Archaeologists, hearing vague references to a collapsed Zedi with an unusual number of bones beneath it, sought permission to investigate. They brought tools more refined than crude shovels and questions shaped by theories about ritual foundations, ancient engineering, and the intersection of belief and stone. The villagers, descendants of those who had witnessed the collapse, watched them with guarded eyes. Some wanted the past left alone, fearing that disturbing the bones again would awaken echoes best left sleeping. Others were curious, wondering if outsiders might finally confirm what their stories had long insisted, that the hill was not merely haunted, but the site of a crime committed by power against the powerless. The archaeologists dug carefully, peeling back layers of soil and root. They uncovered remnants of the pagoda's base, its stones shifted and fractured, but still showing traces of once precise geometry. They found tool marks etched by hands long turned to dust. They found offerings, small beads, metal fragments, clay vessels sealed and empty. And they found bones, many bones, some near the surface, others deeper, packed into cavities that did not match the practical needs of any known architectural reinforcement. In their reports, they wrote cautiously. They spoke of possible foundation burials, of evidence consistent with ritual sacrifice, of mass deposition of human remains within a structural context. They compared the site with similar rumors in other parts of the region, where stories whispered of bridges that required corpses in their footings, walls that would not stand unless a person disappeared into them. They argued among themselves in quiet rooms about how much was practical superstition, how much was institutionalized violence wrapped in sacred language.
Meanwhile, the villagers told the archaeologists a different kind of truth. They spoke of nights when the pagoda cried, of crimson streaks on stone, of children who went into the forest and never returned. They spoke of a monk who came from far away and tried to ease the dead, an architect who shattered under the weight of what he had helped create. They spoke in circles and fragments, because that is how communities remember collective horror, never in clean, straight lines, but in loops and spirals, returning again and again to the same raw points until they become part of the land itself. The scholars wrote those stories down in their notebooks, translating them into tidy phrases: local myth, oral tradition, legend of the Ghost Pagoda. They knew that the line between myth and history is rarely solid. They knew, too, that written records are only one kind of evidence, and not always the truest one.
In time, essays and books would debate the existence of human sacrifice in Burmese pagoda construction. Some scholars would point to sites like this hill, the bones beneath the stone, the consistency of stories across distant regions. Others would urge caution, wary of projecting sensational narratives onto cultures already misunderstood and exoticized. The arguments would flow across languages and continents, rising and fading like distant tides. But the land did not argue. The hill still carried its own quiet testimony. Some nights, when the air in Myanmar hangs particularly still and the cicadas quiet themselves all at once, travelers say they feel a slight shiver pass through the ground under their feet near forgotten ruins. Some report that certain pagodas, even newly restored ones, seem to hum faintly when you lean your back against them, as if a slow, steady breath moves inside the stone. A few claim that on overcast nights, if you walk near old temple sites and pause, you might hear, very faintly, the sound of children reciting half-remembered rhymes in a language you almost recognize. Perhaps these are tricks of the mind, primed by stories and shadows. Perhaps they are coincidences or misinterpretations of wind and echo and the ringing in one's ears after a long, hot day. Or perhaps something older is at work, a memory etched not just into human minds, but into the soil, the stone, the flow of the river itself. The Ghost Pagoda of Burma no longer stands, its tiers no longer angled toward the sky, no golden finial gleams at its peak. In the jungle, its stones lie scattered, softened by moss, surrounded by trees whose roots delve into places where bones once lay in tight, silent crowds. To most, it is just another ruin among many in a land dense with sacred architecture. But to those who know how to listen, it remains a wound that never fully closes. When travelers come, the villagers sometimes point toward the hill and tell them the story in their own way. They speak of a king who tried to bargain with destiny, of astrologers who mistook cruelty for necessity, of a structure that fed on the lives of the young in the name of eternity. They speak of the night the pagoda cried, of the bones that spilled out, of the dead who refused to remain politely hidden in the footnotes of history. And then, when the telling is done and silence settles between listener and teller, someone will usually add one last detail. That if you ever find yourself standing in the shadow of an old pagoda in Burma, alone at dusk, and you feel the stone beneath your hand thrumming very softly, not with your own pulse, but with something older, you should step back, bow your head, and whisper a small apology. Not because you built it, not because you ordered it, but because you are standing on a world that remembers every sacrifice made to hold its monuments upright. Some pagodas are built on stone, some on faith, and some, the ghost pagodas, the ones people speak of only in low, careful tones, were built on human sacrifice, their foundations not just rooted in the earth, but in the bones and breath of those who never chose to be part of them. Their bricks may crumble, their gold may flake away,
but their stories walk on, soft-footed and watchful, through the forests and fields of Burma, long after the last stone has fallen.